by the way, Bob, this book is going to be in the Fuel for Mind and Mission free to staff. It'll be one of the ones we could, sometime in the next few weeks. It'll be one of the ones we commend to all our GFM staff in conjunction with Mundelein.
Very good. Very good. Jerry, by the way, that's Bobby Gross, who's our Director for Grad and Faculty Ministry. So welcome, Bobby. And I'm going to go ahead and welcome everyone to our conversation today on public intellectuals and the common good. We're going to be having a conversation with Jerry Pattengale, who I'll be introducing in a few moments. Before that, just want to touch on a couple of things. We do want to let you know that our conversation today is being recorded. If you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, please we already have your mics muted, but please disable your video. And by continuing to participate in the ESN conversation with your video or audio enabled, after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes, including posting a video recording online for asynchronous viewing. I'll stop the recording now to allow you time to disable your video and audio if you prefer not to be recorded. And I'd like to introduce to you Jerry Pattengale, who is our presenter today. There's a great picture of Jerry, and he looks a lot like that in person. And Jerry is a graduate of Miami University, which is very exciting to me as a fellow Ohioan. He has his PhD from there. He's a scholar, researcher, author, and speaker. He's served for over 20 years in administrative leadership at Indiana Wesleyan University. He's currently the first to earn the university's title of university professor. He's the executive director of education for the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., where he oversees an international team of academics, writers, researchers, media specialists, and editors developing Bible curricula for high school students. He's authored a number of books. He's a nationally recognized lecturer on education, innovation, and biblical studies. He's a senior fellow at the Sagamore Institute, an honorary senior associate at Tyndall House, Cambridge, distinguished fellow at Excelsior College, Australia, and is a research scholar at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Christianity Today, Washington Post, Books and Culture, Religion News Service, Inside Higher Ed, and a number of other publications. He won international acclaim in the mid-1990s for his work on the Odyssey in Egypt program, connecting U.S. middle school students via the internet with the archaeological excavation of an early Egyptian monastery. He also currently directs nationalconversations.com, is an associate publisher for Christian Scholars Review, and serves on the board of Religion News Service and Yale University's Jonathan Edwards Center. He and his wife, Cindy, have 4 sons and 2 grandsons. And so I'd love to welcome Jerry to our conversation today. Jerry, glad to have you with us.
Well, thank you. It's good to see all of you here, and wish I could sit and have coffee face to face with all of you.
Well, one of these days, perhaps we're going to be able to arrange that. I look forward to that. Well, I wondered if you might start and just tell us a little bit about how the book that we're talking about today, Public Intellectuals for the Common Good, came about.
Well, I guess like Jamie Smith at Calvin, I think many of us have little pods of fellow researchers, and I think all of us should have that wherever you're at. And so we would meet regularly about some of the key issues, and Posner's, his research where basically he's asking, where are all the, public intellectuals? Are they in decline? And then a whole wave of books and articles and so forth were in the making about that. And so we wanted to look at it from the perspective of where evangelicals are in that. Because a lot of these studies are kind of staid, if you will, or they're simply looking at the number of people that seem to surface whatever metric they're using. And I was in a meeting, one of the meetings, where one of the, I won't name the scholar, you would all probably know this person, and he or she said, well, here's the model we're going to use. We're going to study, we're going to interview this number of professors from Research One universities and get our definitions. And so after we talked for a while, I said, why would you only interview professors from Research One universities for this project? So right from the start, there was the elimination of all these professors, brilliant men and women at private schools and tier 2 schools, or people who chose on vocation, or the very thing that is at the heart of a public intellectual for Christians. And so we decided to look at it from an evangelical perspective. And we also knew if we were to do that, we need to have voices that would command the respect of people in this space, and a diverse group, both in many ways. And fortunately, I thank God for this, we were able to find those people that would contribute. And if you've looked at the table of contents, that is pretty, I think, pretty obvious. By the way, the other two editors with me in my research group that we meet pretty regularly and are in touch almost every day for many years. Chris Devers is assistant professor at Johns Hopkins, and Todd Ream is a distinguished professor over at Taylor University, which is only about 20 minutes from Indiana Wesleyan University. So even though I'm involved in DC, I still have stayed at Indiana Wesleyan. When I was at the scriptorium, I told myself, if I ever leave this kind of work with artifacts and ancient Bibles, so forth, I'll go back to university. I'll not give up my rank again this side of heaven if I can help it. So anyway, that's how we came to this. We really felt like there needed to be a voice for evangelicals in this space, because I could name several people I thought could go toe to toe with any person in a discussion, and should be represented in this discussion.
Yeah. Well, you referenced this question at the beginning of where are the public intellectuals that is being talked about widely, as well as in some evangelical circles. George Marston, in his foreword to your book, talks about where are the Reinhold Niebers. And maybe for our audience, you might want to talk a little bit about who Reinhold Niebuhr was, and why he might be considered a model of a public intellectual, and who you would think of as some models for public intellectuals.
Well, when you have Niebuhr and others who are trying to look at the questions of the fabric of societies, not just in one country, but globally, and you're trying to look at how they resonate with what God wanted in the world, then you're getting at the larger questions. And so what's happened when you have someone that you set up as an example who speaks to life's ultimate questions, which are ultimately, for most people, either philosophical or theological, you start whittling down who you think public intellectuals can be. And so I think it's a good question to start here. Let me say this. I believe, as an evangelical, that the public intellectuals need to have a firm grasp on theology. And most of those through the years have come out of the Reformed tradition because they simply have more of a training, in their childhood. I'm Wesleyan. Mm-hmm. So I became a Christian when I was 16 out of high school, and I didn't have the systematic apparatus, had to really dive in and learn that. And so what's happened, I think, in the academy is we've had a shift away in the academy overall in the United States, away from theological questions, only to philosophical, and then to specialization. And so I position our book positions that as evangelicals, we really need to go back to the theological questions and then build out from there all of our learning. Hopefully that helps, Bob.
Yeah. Well, that takes me into the question of how would you define a public intellectual? What do public intellectuals do?
Well, public intellectuals, we in our foreword, we look at a lot of different books on this. InterVarsity Press has a couple new ones out. We actually ended up going to Michael Desch's definition. It's one who exerts a large influence in the contemporary society of his or her origin, and is able to have an influence through thought and through their voice and through their work. And so, and I might even add regular, and you can find the exact quote of that in there. I might say, Bob, and I don't know when we want to get into this, there are a lot of categories of very smart people that we see in public. I don't think my dendrites are anywhere near the levels of some of the people I admire, like my own mentor, Edwin Yamauchi. And I just came in, by the way. I was stuck in the airport hotel for a couple of days and had 2 laptops crash while I was out. And I thought, when I look at these different categories of public intellectuals that people use, I think some of them are simply geniuses in public. Ken Jennings is probably the most obvious right now with the talk shows about Jeopardy. He's brilliant. Would we call him public intellectual? I don't know, Ken, but I would probably say he's more of simply a genius in public. I have many friends that are either Mensa or we've tested Mensa. Doesn't make them a public intellectual. I think we have intellectuals in public. So they're not just geniuses, they're also intellectuals. They're people that have shown or demonstrated critical thinking skills. They're heralded in their guilds. And it's sort of like a therapist being called at trial. They are a seasoned expert in a particular niche that can offer help in certain of the public questions, for an orderly existence with one another, whether it's in a trial or whether it's in a sewer system or whatever. And so they're intellectuals in public, and so you have those people. Then you have people who are not simply intellectuals in public and not simply geniuses in public. They're genius intellectuals in public. And it could be like the show out now, the Queen's Gambit. You would probably see them as geniuses who are also intellectuals. The other day, I was at a meeting where, because of COVID, she couldn't come. And some of you know Leadership in Turbulent Times, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She was awesome. She joined us by video on the conference.
Yeah, I love her work.
Yeah. It's just so researched, but there's a history of thought there with Doris that is admirable. I would consider a public intellectual. Most people consider her an intellectual, at least an intellectual in public and a genius in public. So in this case, I think it's a good example of all three in one. And Pulitzer has lost some of its gravitas with some of the recipients, according to if you're following the banter, but not in this case, from my perspective.
Now, you add or associate in your title public intellectuals and the common good. Talk a little bit about the common good and how. Why do you add that to your discussion of public intellectuals?
When we're in a meeting like this, I would love to ask Julian, Joseph, or Tammy their definitions, because it is a tough conversation. But in the end, we came to the conclusion that from a theological beginning, with the ultimate question being theological, am I who I am because of who God is, or is God who he is because of who I am. I mean, ultimately, if you start with God and the Trinity, the version of common good we have is the beatific view of God, where we are trying to redound back in the time we have on earth, the uncreated order of the Trinity. And not to get too much in the weeds on the theology part, but I think we're trying to reflect as much as we can what we understand to be the goodness of God in the parts of the Trinity that we believe in faith. And so that's what we start as Christians, as evangelicals. That's what we are purporting here. And I can say on this note here, I remember reading volumes on discussions of common good and the difference between common good and public good, and the misnomer of a democratic good, where a common good simply is that which is best for the most people or the majority of the people. And there's merit to that, and you want there to be good in helping with the welfare of as many people as possible. But everyone on this broadcast knows that there are many countries where what people decided was the best for the good took the lives of millions of people. And so as Christians, whether you're gifted academics, whether you're public intellectuals, you want to represent for the moral benefit of your brother and sister, and the ontological benefit, the well-being as God has intended for us to live out. And so that's where we're at. We wrestled, Bob, with this for a long time, and so hopefully in the forward we're able to capture a little bit of Aquinas here in our understanding of the common good. If I could segue to one other aspect of that, if you go to Books and Culture, I think it might still be up. I wrote a review of Cronman's book, Life's Ultimate Questions. Are any of you familiar with that book? I'm looking
you
at
put that in the chat if you are.
But anyway, that book came out, and I remember it stopped me in my tracks. He was dean of Yale Law School, a gifted person. But the title of the book is Life's Ultimate Questions. Why have the universities, education's end, life's ultimate question, why have universities given up on life's ultimate questions? And in there, it's a fascinating book and a nice diachronic analysis. But in the book, he blames the churches for taking over that territory, for taking over questions about life and death and about virtue and about well-being. And I'm reading that, I'm thinking the church didn't take over those questions. The university started out of those questions, and then the secularization of the university kicked out those questions, and the church by default was the place where people went to try to find the answers to those. So that's where I love his book, I recommend it, but I took a strong, I opposed him on that because the church didn't steal those questions. They took them by default, and hopefully never gave up on them.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to a question of about how Christians engage in public, are involved in public intellectual engagement. How forthright ought Christians, particularly in the academy and the wider society, how forthright ought Christians be about their theological convictions and the convictions that shape their ideas and the things that they're proposing in public engagement? How forthright do you think Christians ought to be about their faith in public?
Well, part of it depends, just be candid here, part of it depends on their intellectual ability to defend their views. I've noticed that some people are bolder, and I'm thinking, well, if you're John Lennox, you can be bold like that.
Yeah.
So I have friends that are every bit as intelligent and as quick as John, and they they may only put a couple of references in all of their books. One of them is handled more manuscripts, I think, anyone in the world, Christopher de Hamill. You can look him up. He's a good friend of mine. And Christopher has one of the best books, I think, in modern times on manuscripts. And it's, Meaningful Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts or something of that nature. It's a bestseller in Europe. And in there, he talks about the communion of the saints. And so his choice is to talk about something that really is meaningful that he has found in these manuscript traditions. So for him to talk about his faith, he's the one, by the way, that when the Pope visited Westminster, he was holding Augustine's Gospels, when the Pope came down. I mean, he was over the Parker Library until retired recently at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. And so for him, it's a matter of when the time comes, and it may be once every decade in public, you express it in your written work. He's more of a intellectual that you find in his written work and in public that way. For others, like John Lennox, it's pretty blunt. And let me share this contrast. So I was in a meeting once. We put together with Stan Rosenberg. Some of you know Stan. Dr. Stan Rosenberg is a wonderful Augustine scholar in Oxford. It came out of Catholic University. Forgive me, Stan, when you see this, if I got the wrong university, but Stan has done a great job developing SCIO program for CCU in Oxford, and he's on the theology faculty. So we developed the Logos program, which brings in, it's kind of like what this whole broadcast is about, is for many years, the Green family has funded scholars that are working on our manuscripts at the Museum of the Bible. It's the one thing we did that was overtly Christian, that you opted in knowing that it was, how do you maintain your Christian faith in tough programs at a high level in manuscript and biblical studies? And now it's spread to all disciplines. And we funded them to go and gave them a stipend. And so the whole thing is how do you engage at a high level? These are all very gifted students. Many of them know many more languages than I know. And from a wide variety of schools, Melange schools, from Ivy Leagues to those that are barely accredited, but they're gifted students, men, women, different races. And so we invited quite a few scholars from Oxford, Cambridge to come, Leicester, other places, British Library. We've done it for many years, 30 a year. Alistair McGrath comes in and we ask him that question, Bob. You call Alistair. Alistair made a great case for making sure that you have your calling card. And for him, it would also be established publications before you do what you just asked. He said, make sure you have your ticket. Make sure you have your entrance into the academy. And he made a great case for it. And you've read Alistair's works. He's wonderful. By the way, if you ever he did a wonderful job every year. He loves to talk about Dorothy Sayers, and C.S. Lewis and others as well. So John Lennox comes in the next day, and I'll never forget it. He leans on his podium because, before I start, I got to tell you something, because I understand, there's scholars in here already. You young scholars know 10, 12 languages. He said, I got to tell you right now, if you don't go down to your professor's office, or if you don't let them know right up front that you believe in the supernatural, that you believe in God, and that's your starting point, you never will. And he said, you need to do it right up front. He shared a story about how he disagreed with the professor, and he walked right down to his office and confronted him and says, that is not logical based on the presuppositions that resonate with truth. And truth matches reality. And of course, for him with his mathematical analysis. And we're sitting there just, he had no idea Alistair had said that the day before. So probably, it's a long answer to the question. That's the best answer I can give to you. If those two have that much of a difference, wow. I will say this throughout, and you'll see this in our book, especially with Mark Knoll, the other book, we did a book earlier, The State of the Evangelical Mind, but with Mark and with Miroslav, and they live their life out like this too. Pattengale. Oh my goodness, what a wonderful human being. Heather Templeton, Bill. If there's not humility in your approach, then the starting place that we talked about with this vision of the Trinity, if there's an arrogance and if there's a self-serving nature of this, no matter when you start to bring your Christianity into the picture, you will lose your audience, or you will lose your respect of a lot of your fellow Christians. And I'm from the holiness tradition, so it's especially hard because, you know, for years at the university down the road, I had, you know, no one celebrated publications. They didn't want any attention. I said, well, the university needs you to celebrate your publications. They didn't even want to talk about things they were working on because they thought it was too arrogant, too self-serving. So we had to find a balance there of how to position what you're doing, you know, in a responsible way. So one thing I did early in my career is I started looking around that Council for Christian Colleges and Universities had about 50 some workshops a year. Wonderful workshops. Shirley Hooks is wonderful, and hello Shirley, if you see this later. She's wonderful. The CCU is doing great. Yeah. But I noticed that I was brought to Indiana Wesleyan from Michigan, from the scriptorium. Some of you remember that, the castle in Hereford and so forth. And I always, over all the research and education publications, and I noticed that a lot of people were only speaking at those conferences. And that all of our funds that we raised about $40 million in a very short time. And those funds were only going to Christian conferences. And Shirley herself would say, you need to be engaged in your guilds outside of only the Christian meetings. And so they weren't echo chambers. They were very valuable. I still think you should go to them. Those are your colleagues. And I think though that you need to have a steady presence, like David Riggs. David Riggs is over the John Wesley Honors College, Indiana Wesleyan University. I think is as solid as one experience one could hope for. David went through Zeus Pacific, Princeton, and Christ Church, Oxford in classics. And David, no matter which one of those conferences he goes to, he has always kept a seat at the table, the National Honors Programs and in the Classic Society. So just a comment, and I think most of you probably do that, but I found myself loving those Christian conferences. And one day in my devotional time, I felt a little conflicted because in my undergraduate years, I had a brilliant professor. If you read my, I don't know if they saw it, Bob, if you put it out there, but recently I wrote a piece, I can't remember if we talked about it, in a religion news service called Capital Offense, how a Christian professor warned of the situation 50 years ago. And, but one of the things I don't talk about in that article, it's only 800 words, that's all you get. You know, I talk about his view of the warning that don't think that the capital is impregnable, but then I talk about here are the logical steps based on his presuppositional analysis of the world, which is where I started with this. You know, and the big philosophical questions of ontology, teleology, axiology, epistemology, but starts with theology. He said, here's where you're going to end up. If you start with this beginning, you're going to end up here. And he said, you have to remember government is God's gift to us for the orderly coexistence and positive attainments of his created human beings. And you know, but when I had him in the undergraduate years, I noticed he had never published. He spoke around the world for Youth with a Mission. The picture, I think, in that article that they chose is from a Youth with a Mission. He was a much in demand speaker at YWAM conferences, and yet he the book that he finally published was actually posthumous, and his students actually finished it for him. And I thought, whether it's one book or whether it's many books, and it's certainly not the number of books anyone publishes. I met Harper Lee's agent right before she died, and And I told him at the time, I said, Scott, I'd rather have one To Kill a Mockingbird than dozens of other titles. And he said, "Would we all?" And but I was convicted early on at a Christian school, and that's what David Brooks says. When you read our book, David Brooks says that when he was seeking, faith in his own life, and I happened to have been with David some during that time of the Faith Angle forums down South Beach. He said some Christians built ramps, like Michael Cromartie, his good friend, and he said others built walls to him really understanding the faith at the level that he was seeking in a fullness. And he said the ramps were those humble people that, like Michael Cromartie, that could also ask the tough questions and demanded excellence. And he said the walls, this is amazing. He said, the walls come from those that have an inferiority complex. And I scared them. I think he's saying I scared them. And he talks about his time teaching the Yale students and how there's just that demand for excellence and how they challenge you. And I could show you many Christian schools that one of my degrees from Wheaton, and that happened in the Wheaton classes too. But I think that the challenging the question, he did say, and I agree with David Brooks here. He said the acceptance of mediocrity in our scholarship is sacrilege. That's a powerful statement.
Wow. Oh. Hey, Jerry, we're going to take a break here. I want to actually let people know a little bit about the book and how they can get it. And so we're going to just take a breather here, and then get into some question and answer. And if people have questions they want to ask for Jerry, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we will get to those. So let me just highlight Jerry's book. The book that we're talking about today is Public Intellectuals and the Common Good, and it can be ordered at a 30% discount at InterVarsity Press. And we're going to put this information in the chat. And when you check out, just use the code GFM Web 21. So that'll be in the chat. There you go. Okay. Well, as people are putting questions in the chat, and we encourage you, one of the things you mentioned Heather Templeton Dill, and she had this wonderful chapter in your book where she looked at three figures that had received Templeton Prizes. She's the president of the Templeton Foundation, and she focused on King Abdullah of Jordan, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Lord Jonathan Sacks of Great Britain, and Alvin Plantinga as a Christian. People from three different faiths, but all that she would characterize as public intellectuals for the common good. I thought it might be interesting for this group, particularly faculty, aspiring faculty, and other researchers, maybe to talk a little bit about Plantinga and what she singled out in his life that stood out in her portrait of him, and they're selecting him for that award.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to his aggressive persistence of respecting pluralism. I'm trying to remind myself exactly who he was with. You might help me on this one here, on who it was that he interfaced with.
Well, I think he she spoke both about his scholarship and his vigorous engagement as a Christian, very forthright in his intellectual work around the existence of God, and willingness to engage all comers in terms of conversation about that. But she also talked about his mentoring with students and the influence that he had in their lives. And I can add a personal story to her story. I have a good friend who's a philosophy professor at Ohio State, who is a friend of Alvin's, has gone rock climbing with him and so forth. This professor's an atheist, but has a deep regard for Alvin. It turned out, he said, unbeknownst to him, Alvin actually wrote a recommendation for him when he was applying for his position at Ohio State. And she talks some about the humility of him and how he cared for students. And so that was striking to me.
Yeah, in fact, I recall that all of the prize winners. She actually accents that, and she included a letter of endorsement from Thomas Nagel that had worked alongside of him in different projects and so forth. He says Plantinga is consistently fair to opposing views and arguments, and he represents his own arguments with admirable clarity. And of course, we all know that about his work. As someone without, by the way, when you have different people who have been at religious schools, and then transfer out to other people, to other universities, it also reflects the error of only polling people at certain types of universities about these questions. So anyway, I think, that's what I remembered. I couldn't remember, who it was, because the other ones are talking about the kings. In fact, what's interesting on this note, Bob, on February 14th of last year, I was asked to speak at the United Nations, and the subject was protecting religious places. And it was the King of Jordan who funded it, so, and it was a truly, it was a truly diverse group of people trying to work to the same. As little did we know what was going to happen to religious places right after that. We're talking about ISIS and so forth. And then suddenly they're under attack for different reasons. But it's that common theme. And when I was in undergraduate school, and I haven't always done the best at this because, I think maybe getting excited or talking while still thinking, which might be dangerous for me. But I remember distinctly once Dr. Yamauchi called me back in, and I was his assistant the first year. And it was over the spelling of the word archaeologist. He called me in, shut the door. He gave me I think it was he drank cold cherry Pepsis, I think, or cherry Cokes. Or, excuse me, hot, not cold. They just took them out of his desk drawer. He said, Jerry, he goes, just remember that there's more than one way to spell archaeologist. And basically he was telling me that's a Pyrrhic victory, and it's more important to treat someone that looks at things differently, whether it's just one word or whether it's the world. And that's who Yamauchi is, but he can dig his heels in and also stand up for truth and stand up for what he thinks is error. I mean, so that's what I took away from Heather's chapter, is all three of them had worked with people across the aisles, and whether it's politics or religions, and found wasn't just common ground, but common goodness to strive for.
I'm still looking. We hope we can get a few more questions here. I think we just got one. Can you comment on the importance of moral character and integrity for a public intellectual, along with their ideas and communication skills?
Yeah, one of my biggest heartbreaks in my career is having worked with one of the best scholars in the world in manuscripts and find out he was allegedly, it's still in courts, stealing hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions. I don't know the exact amount. Some of you may have followed this. You can Google Christianity Today article I wrote on it. So I blew the whistle on a case where someone had a serious ethical problem, and someone that was, went to church regularly in England and so forth. It's tough. And then my own son, our oldest son, who lives in Alaska, is distraught right now. He's distraught trying to deal with Ravi Zacharias' situation. Ravi's lecture, my undergraduate, I was a brand new Christian, saved basically in this class on presuppositions. Our son is just trying to figure out where to go to and how where the truth is in what these people are saying if their moral lives are so incongruent with their intellectual statements.
Mm.
And so I don't know if it's Bobby who asked that question. I do think it's important, and I think that we need to be careful that we don't associate probity or moral error with intellectual misstatements. I mean, you have a lot of people who have written powerful books in great helped with the orderliness of humankind who have made horrendous moral decisions. And as we were trying to help our own son, of course, we went to the Bible, went to King David, went to some of the standard places. You start pulling, Kaiser, you start pulling Yancey, other people, Keller, that have written on some of these subjects. And so I think it's just tough. I don't have the best answer for that. All I know is that it reflects the fallen nature of man and the need for God's grace and mercy. But we also need to, as educators, as academics, if you're an intellectual, we need to be able theologically to support the notion that truth will stand regardless of people's lack to stand on morals, to stand morally. And that has happened throughout history. So you could write a book. I mean, I could call Julian or Joseph perhaps, say, hey, let's sit down and chart out examples of this where people have helped the common good or have reflected the common good or have attributed or have supplied things that have helped in the cultural mandate for those who hold to Amy Sherman's books, and I recommend to all of you. And yet they have made mistakes that have cost them dearly. And about every year, there's a professor at a Christian school somewhere, or a Christian professor at a secular school who has ethically made a mistake or who has morally found him or herself in trouble. And we need to separate that from truth. Your rejection of the truth, one's rejection of the truth doesn't nullify that truth.
Mm-hmm.
And one's disconnection in action, from that same truth doesn't change that. So, and I know you all know that, but I'm working through this in a very personal way, and sorry for getting off on too much of that tangent, but I'm trying to write a response to my own son, who is not struggling in his faith as much as has this inner struggle to understand how someone could come to the place that Ravi did before he died.
Hmm. Hey, I want to take a question here from John that says, it seems to me that an immense challenge today in evangelical circles are the divisions between right and left. And in your emphasis on common good, it seems to suggest something about Christians being the people who sort of move beyond those divisions or whatever. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about that.
So if I could recast your question, if I were writing an article for Wall Street or for the Post or someplace, how can Democrats work with Republicans? Basically, is what you're asking. Christians who are a Democrat, Republican, and all of us, I assume, have wonderful, wonderful friends on both sides of the aisle. I think that for me, in the projects I've been on in DC, and the projects I've been on in books, most of my early career was at State University speaking on purpose-guided education. I think for us is to be able to show a noble end and a noble cause that we can endorse. The mantra from my early books, and not that it's anything special, and whatever we have is ephemeral at best, but the dream needs to be stronger than the struggle. And I realize I need to help people understand what what a healthy dream is and why it. And for me, it redounds the glory of God and it reflects, God's calling for us. But how do you talk across the aisle on the secular aisle? I'm not talking about Democrat, Republican. How do you reach across that with that conversation? And so then I started realizing that same question is important across the political aisle. And if we can find noble causes that represent not just dreams, but mature dreams and articulate dreams and dreams with research behind solutions. And I needed to help do that in an objective way. You can go to RE today in England. They actually used what I had developed, asked me to condense it for all the schools in England. It's how do you decide what a noble cause is? And I took them through literature. I took them through historical statements and had them self-identify. I couldn't show, the Bible has these characteristics. And so what I was doing is actually trying to get at what I'm suggesting here is that when I work with Republicans or Democrats or independents, I have a friend who's libertarian, we focus on the noble cause. And I asked the same question, Bob, or whoever asked it. I was asked to speak in California, and I was invited to stay at a family's house, and they took me out to dinner, and I didn't know much about them other than the invitation came really through their fitting to this school. And I invited to take them to Starbucks afterwards. It was right next to where we're eating, and they laughed. And what I didn't know is the man I was eating with helped Howard start Starbucks. And he's a strong evangelical Christian, and his son was being mentored by a friend of mine at Azusa in track. And I'll never forget, I said, James, can I just ask you a question? I said, I'm in the Midwest, and Starbucks is, I go to Starbucks. I like their coffee. I like their Verona. That's the only coffee I like at Starbucks. But I said, there are so many things that are presented all the time about how far it is in its positions to most Christians, Republican or Democrat. I said, he goes, you're asking how I could agree to work with Howard because he's seen as anti-Christian to a lot of people. I said, well, yeah, I guess. He said, Jerry, it's easy. He said early on, he started talking about his humanitarian causes that he hoped to help. And he said, as a Christian, I could get behind that. He said, so I focused on all the revenue, all the resources that would be going into, saving trafficked children or clean water or whatever. Those are good causes that help a lot of people. And so that would be my response. I was going in, I remember speaking UTEP, and when right across from Juarez, and they told me all the needs and trying to figure out how to help them. And I wouldn't care if someone's a Democrat or Republican or Libertarian. These are kids that were fearful of being shot or stolen, and boy, they tried to find solutions. So for me, it was, I would suggest, it is identifying noble causes and to be able to articulate why that cause is noble.
Hey, Jonathan asked a question that was kind of clarifying something from earlier in your talk. And he said, I didn't catch the distinction you were making between geniuses in public and intellectuals in public and genius intellectuals in public. Can you clarify that for him and perhaps for the rest of us?
Yeah, and well, I said, yeah, well, I hope I can clarify that. But basically, it's this for me, is a genius is someone who God has gifted with abilities to memory, or when I'm writing a book, In the Shadow of Geniuses. It's called Borrowed Intelligence, Learning in the Shadow of Geniuses. And so there are people that simply have this a mind that has capacities that other minds don't have. We know that occurs. An intellectual, the distinction between a genius and an intellectual is someone who has been steeped in research. A genius may not be, but steeped in research, steeped also in reflection. And I think I wrote out a note here that had a third area. yeah, research, critical thinking and reflection. So intellectuals, I think, have those qualities in them. The public intellectual then also, is able to take and use those for, to propose viable solutions, for normative problems of society. And so when you go through Bloom's taxonomy, it's memory is the lowest form. It's the lowest level. And I took Jerry Lucas's memory workshop, and I remember going in. I was young, I was in my early 20s, maybe not even 20, but I was speaking at a big camp, 150 people. And I remember I was able to memorize all the names, and everyone's and then I realized I felt convicted, because why was I doing that? It was really offering nothing to them. And it was more important. God convicted me, says, "Are you memorizing my scripture? If you're going to do that, do it for a greater good." But it was the lowest level. And if you Bloom's taxonomy, then you're able to pull those things apart and put them back together, the synthesis, and then apply them to something. So an intellectual has ability to do that. And a public intellectual, I think, finds a platform, and she finds a way to disseminate it. And sometimes someone has to help that person to do that. They don't know how to get to it. Hopefully that's full.
No, that's good. That's good. Hey, we got just a couple minutes together. So I was wondering if you could kind of give us maybe I would call it a bullet point wrap up of what you think are the critical things in a person's life who aspires to public intellectual work for the common good. What would be the things that such a person ought focus on?
I think first of all, to have a healthy appreciation for those people who are contributing in spaces that you have an interest in.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, to have if you come to my office, for example, I try to read brilliant writers. If I turn my laptop around, you would see Hemingway quotes and Hemingway's typewriters right here. It's the same, not the same exact one, but so a helpful appreciation for those who are in spaces that you would you have an interest in being in, because you learn on how to be better yourself. Mm-hmm. Keep a file of what you would do differently than the person in that. It might be more humility, might be better grammar, might be some things that you can improve on. And so I would say keep a file in case you are tapped. And I would say, for me, it's to be prepared for a time when God might call you to be in that space. And it's not a success to be in that space if God doesn't call you to do that. You might be making that contribution, like Dr. Martin that I write about in Religion News Service. When I spoke at his funeral, the room was packed with people from around the world. And so he was attentive to what God called him to do. And so I would say to keep a file, and also to be prepared. I once landed, and as I landed, my phone buzzed, and they said, "Jerry, we will have a car ready for you. We want you to go immediately to film for Wolf Blitzer on the Coptic fragment that was just discovered, Jesus What." Coptic is one of my languages. I had no preparation. I think my Coptic books are behind me somewhere, but I haven't had my Lambdom volume out for a couple of years, and Benghazi hit, and so the episode never aired. But I didn't feel ready for that interview, and maybe God protected me. And this might sound over religious to some people. I don't know where you're all from, but I believe in the end of Deuteronomy, and I believe in Deuteronomy 3, where God was preparing Joshua for what was ahead for him, and God had Moses anoint him. And I have made my share of mistakes, Bob, and I don't think anything ethically or morally of that nature, but I've made plenty of mistakes. But I think that God's anointing has helped me, and my wife has certainly helped me, to either rein things back, whatever at times. But I think there's an anointing there where we recognize that God is the one who is really in control of how we're to be used, and to be thankful for that time. And the thing that's in this book all the way through, in Heather's chapter especially, in the life of Miroslav, if you've been around Miroslav,
Mhm.
uh, if you've been around Tim Keller, these folks, there's a humility. Even in someone like Rick Warren, who I think is a public intellectual. If you're around Rick Warren, he's boisterous and he's fun, but he 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 give, what does he give, 90% or 99% of all his funds back to the church? He's not doing this for himself. It's really about his actual office is a little tiny thing. He's got this gorgeous office, looks like Christ Church's library when you walk in, but it's actually just this plain little place where he's with his books and he's trying to help people to understand how to live a life for God.
Mhm.
And so that's um,
That's a
I'm
great way. That's a great place to close. We will need to wrap here, but we want to just highlight again your book, um, The Public Intellectuals and the Common Good. And you have the link to the University Press website where you can order the book. And I hope we've whet your appetite for that today. We do just want to let you know about the next conversation we have, and that's with Gordon Smith, and who is the president. I should have double checked this. President, I believe it's Anselm College in Canada, and he's going to be talking about institutional intelligence and how we navigate the organizations, or if we're in leadership in an organization, how we build organizations. And I'm looking forward. We've had Gordon in a variety of different settings in grad and faculty ministry, and he just does a great job. And we'll have this information in the chat as well. And finally, we just want to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to thank Jerry, especially on a little travel weary, getting snowed into an airport for a while. I really appreciate his joining us in the midst of many travels. We want to thank University Press, who helps set up these conversations and offers the books at a discount. We are grateful for their partnership with us. And finally, we want to thank you for joining us. We hope you will also take advantage of some of the other resources that the Emerging Scholars Network offers, all of which are available for free. You can join the Emerging Scholars Network at our blog.emergingscholars.org. We'd love for you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESN IVCF. And this conversation and the conversations we've had since last July are available on our ESN channel on YouTube. And there's a link there, just tinyurl.com, ESN YouTube will get you there, or you can search that. And so you can pass the word along to others who weren't able to join our call today. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and we will leave the call open for a few minutes, and you're able to chat informally. And so thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.